May all that I say be to the glory of God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. If you are a Christian and you find that the way of Jesus fits really neatly into your life, it's kind of a tidy fit, always really has been. If you are a Christian and the way of Jesus has never once challenged your worldview, it's always kind of gone along with what you've always just assumed to be right, might I gently but pastorally tell you that you might need to recheck who is following who. It's often been said that, God, of course, made all of humankind in his image, and ever since we've never quit repaying the favor. We just keep remaking God in our own. And we can do this so easily with Jesus. The way that Jesus is spoken about by people who, oddly enough, don't sound at all like Jesus, tell you everything you need to know on that count. And yet in Jesus' actual day, these persons who were listening to him, these disciples who were trying to follow him, when they heard him speak, when they saw him act, their reaction was surprise. Sometimes out-and-out shock. And not too often was it just not going all the way over to scandal. But this is what's going to happen if you say things like this in our world: the first shall be last, and the last shall be first. You are to love your enemies. You are to turn the cheek. The meek are going to inherit the earth. It's easier for a camel to go through an eye of a needle than for the rich to get into heaven. How does that fit so nicely and neatly in a worldview that any of us would choose to carry? Today we come across Jesus and he's having a really bad week. He's having a really bad week at home because nobody knows what to make of Jesus, and what they do know about him, they apparently don't like. Now today's story follows immediately after last week's. If you remember that, if you were here, this was about the raising of the little girl back to life. It was about the healing of the woman who had been hemorrhaging for 12 years. So those were two big-time events. I mean, you raise a child back to life, you heal a terribly sick woman, and I'd say you're having a good week in ministry. I'll admit that sort of day is not what we call Monday around here. But as good as Jesus' last week was, this one equals it in being bad. For today, Jesus goes home to Nazareth. We're not sure why. Is it to celebrate doing a victory lap at home? Maybe. But if so, it's very short-lived, because when he goes home, everything quickly goes wrong. Now, it starts with him preaching his first sermon at home. You preach your first sermon at home, you want it to go really good. But it's not. He's rejected. They take offense at him. In another gospel, they try to throw him off a cliff at the end. You preach a sermon, people want to throw you out of a cliff. It didn't go good. Thankfully, that hadn't happened. We'll see. My first sermon, I still remember, preached at home, my hometown church in Memphis. Hadn't even gone to seminary yet. They asked me to preach. They acted like they loved it, which tells me that they loved me, because there was no way to love that sermon. I don't even remember what I said. I just kind of remember that it wasn't good. And maybe it's because I'm a preacher, but the fact that Jesus was rejected for preaching at home, it's really sad to me. What's it like to go home and get rejected? Sadly, someone in this room probably knows that feeling. But for the rest of us, it's kind of horrible to imagine, isn't it? I mean, home is where you rely on folks to pull for you. My mom listens to every one of my sermons. She complains if they don't get put up on the website quickly enough. Now, some of you have told me that, you like a sermon here or there, and I can assure you, though, that none of you like any sermon that I've ever given better than my mama liked that sermon. Couldn't even imagine my mom not liking a sermon. Now, if you went to my mom and told her, I just didn't like that sermon, she still would not dislike that sermon. She might just dislike, well, let's just say she would not dislike that sermon. So what in the world was going on with Jesus' sermon so that he would be rejected at home? Well, it's because his message and his way of being didn't fit in with their preconceived ideas about God. It didn't fit their theological worldview, their cultural worldview, about who's in and who's out, who's God's favorite, and who God doesn't care that much for. But as I said, if you are following Jesus and you're never being asked to change or rethink something, then you're not hearing him right. But his hometown crowd, they heard him precisely right. And it got him angry. Now, Mark says everyone initially was astonished by Jesus' wisdom. They heard all these great things. He had a glowing reputation. But apparently much of their problem is that they just couldn't accept that all this was coming from him. From some, this sort of pedestrian place, a carpenter's son. His hometown boy, the brother of maybe the dropout down the street. In other words, a person like them. When they looked at him, all they could see was the boy no one ever paid much attention to. The son of Joseph, who always had problems paying his bills. Mary's boy, conceived in suspicious circumstances. I mean, if he wanted to grow up and just be a carpenter, well, that's fine. But something this big? But come on, didn't anybody in Jesus' hometown ever ask him what he wanted to be when he grew up? Another problem is that Jesus could do no great deed of power in his hometown because of their disbelief in him. In other words, Jesus wouldn't just do for them what they wanted Jesus just to do for them. And we can get in this trap with God as well and think that, God is kind of around just to give us our heart's desires. Like he's some cosmic vending machine in the sky, giving us exactly what we want. You can hear this in how people talk about the relationship to churches. Why they choose to go to one church as opposed to another. They'll say things like, well, when I came to the church, I asked, how does this church fit my needs? How does this church have things that are there for me and my family? Is the organ played at the right volume? Does the choir sing the right songs? Does the pastor wear the right shoes? I don't know what all the criteria is, but you do. Thank you for letting us pass. Of course, we try to meet needs here. We want to make people happy. But the number one question for a church isn't how we're pulling those things off. The number one question for a church is, are we being faithful? And the other problem with all of that is this is just never how Jesus talks about what it means to follow him. I mean, listen, so, Jesus would walk up to these would-be disciples, and he'd say, follow me. And they'd say, okay, well, tell me what that means. And he says, okay, you go and you sell everything you have, every single thing that you have, and you give it all away to the poor. And then you leave behind your family, you get rejected by your friends and your synagogue. You're eventually going to get tortured and more than likely killed by the most powerful empire in the world, Rome, because they rightly see your ways as a threat to their claims of superiority. Well, okay, Jesus, but now how does that meet my needs? And unbelievably, some of them still signed on the dotted line. Jesus didn't promise them what they wanted to be promised. And yet there's one more crucial reason that the hometown crowd didn't accept Jesus, and it's his sermon itself, his message. Now, Mark didn't tell us his sermon, but we know that sermon from other Gospels. And what we know about that sermon is that it ripped apart their homegrown theology. Again, their ideas about God and who God loved, and somehow in their minds who God did not love. It started out great. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, for he has anointed me to preach good news to the poor. And they go, great, we're poor. He has anointed me to give recovery of sight to the blind. I said, well, this sounds wonderful. We have blind around here. To proclaim release from all oppression. Yes, we're oppressed by Rome. And the year of the Lord's favor. And they say, oh, that sounds great. We love being favored by God. And he says, I don't think you're understanding me. That favor isn't just for you. That favor's for the whole world, and by the way, you haven't been showing that favor for the whole world, so let me show you the implications of this. You know how you think you're better than everyone? Well, why was it then, in the time of the prophet Elijah, that Elijah went to a widow in Sidon, a Gentile, outside of Israel, to be taken care of? What, were there no widows in Israel? Were there no lepers in Israel during the prophet Elisha's time? Well, why were none of them cleansed? Why was it Naaman the Syrian who was made whole? I told the Sunday school class a little while ago, the best I could say what this would be like going in the 1950s or early 1960s into Mississippi, into a church, and say, why is it of all these churches and all these pastors all over the South that God had to raise up a prophet named Martin Luther King Jr.? It tore at their ideas of themselves. It undermined their worldview. It challenged their theology, which wasn't based on love for others, but was instead about propping up their own cultural worldview, their own agendas, their own conceived ways in which they thought the world should work. And this, my friends, is what I believe was the biggest issue that day in Nazareth, even as it remains the greatest challenge to all of us in our reception of Jesus. That Jesus will never allow us to stay as we are. Jesus doesn't come into our towns and into our lives in order to baptize our existing ways of seeing and being and living and believing. Otherwise, there would have never been any reason for him to come at all. Jesus did not come into this world to leave this world the same. He came into the world to change it, thank God, and to change us in it. And so it is that his way, this gospel way, it really is at right angles with the ways of this world. And that is a major reason that we get together. It's why we must get together, to hear these strange stories that help us discern Jesus' way in a world full of a million other ways. To see how very different his ways are from our ways. We open the scriptures and we say, is there any word from the Lord for us in this world today? And we do that because we've spent all the last week listening to all kinds of other words that are most definitely not the Lord's. And more than we wish to admit, it's oftentimes those words which we buy into more than his. And thus, when he speaks of love, an embrace of all, servanthood, radical self-sacrifice for every living human being, reconciliation of all. In this world, such a world as ours, well, it becomes a little easier to see why he was rejected, doesn't it? But maybe the greatest service the church can render the world is to give the world something other than what the world thinks it needs. I found that following Jesus is not just about meeting my needs, but more importantly, about rearranging my needs, giving me needs I would have never known to have had I not shown up to church. The greatest service this church can render this city, this community, this world, is to give it something other than what it thinks it needs. Because what it needs is the church to be the church. When I was interviewing with the search committee to become the rector of this parish, I was brought in during some spring week. And the week before, back where I lived in Pensacola, Florida, they had this unbelievable rainstorm. Made all the national news. It rained 26 inches, over 2 feet, in less than 24 hours. It wasn't a hurricane. In fact, it had more rain in this event than they had in any hurricane on record. Took out streets, a highway, just fell right off a cliff into the water. People's homes were flooded, and cars, and all the rest. It was terrible. As you do in that part of the deep South, somebody has a big old truck. And so a big old group of guys from the church, when we heard that somebody in the church was having particular problems, we'd go over there and try our best to help them. Channel water in a different sort of way, put furniture up, put something, where it wouldn't at least get out of some sort of harm. And we did this all day in this sort of rain. It was terrible rain, and we were soaking wet and just going place to place. And I had this fairly new parishioner, still good friends, named Scotty. And Scotty's kind of sarcastic. And he goes, before I came to this church, that's how he talks, all I ever had to do was just take care of me. Me and my family, my home is fine right now, but here I am outdoors working all day in this pouring rain for all these other people that are not my family. And he goes, and it's wonderful, thank you. And I thought to myself, Scotty, what an amazing compliment you just gave me. Thank you so much for letting me know that I'm doing my job. Still, I bet someone left Nazareth that day saying, I'm sorry, but that new preacher, well, he did not do anything for me today. He did not do a thing for me today. And I wonder if that person ever had the chance to learn that was never his intention at all. The greatest service God renders any of us is to give us things that are other than what we think we need. Amen.